Did you know the Salem witch trials were a relatively tame and short period of time compared to the Scottish witch trials? The Salem witch trials lasted for about a year in 1692, with 20 innocent people being executed and a couple hundred were accused. Meanwhile, the Scottish witch trials took place between the mid 1500s to mid 1700s, and around 4,000 people were accused, 85% were women, and around 2,500 of those innocent people were executed. At this time, Scotland only had a population of 900,000 people, and for context, only about 500 people were killed in the English witch trials, which had occurred during the same time, even though England had a much larger population than Scotland. What was going on during this time in Scotland that allowed for so much killing? How did the witch trials start and how did they end? We'll be answering these questions and more on this week's episode of Yappin' About History. I'm your host, Katie, and this is a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. My main source for this episode is the book How to Kill a Witch, written by Claire Mitchell and Zoe Venditozzi. They also have a podcast called The Witches of Scotland, and I have the book here. Dun, 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 How to Kill a Witch. And then it's really cool on the inside. And then, so if you take the book jacket off, you can see this tartan here. And this was actually a tartan created by the authors, Claire and Zoe. And it is a tartan that honors the victims of Scotland's historic witch trials. This is from their website. And each color and thread has been carefully chosen for its symbolic weight. So the black and gray represents the dark times and the ashes of those who were persecuted. The pink and the red signify the legal tape that bound the fate of the accused and reminds us of the systems that still need challenging. The white check is formed of 3 threads, standing for the campaign's 3 aims: pardon, apology, and memorial. And the large black section of 173 threads marks the 173 years during which the Witchcraft Act was in force from 1563 to 1736. Both years are included in the thread count itself. So I just thought that was really cool. And of course, I've also got my drink with me. Today we've got a witch's brew. I don't know if you can see it. It's supposed to be kind of like a two-toned blue and purple. Look at it. I don't think I did a good job of mixing it, but let's try it. Not bad. It's essentially a gin lemonade, and I also put some sparkly glitter in it. Anyways, so yes, they are the main source. The book's very good. It's nonfiction, but it's very easy to read, and the author's personalities come through with their writing. It's a very engaging and informative book, and I highly recommend reading it. Their purpose for writing the book and producing their podcast is to raise awareness about this part of Scotland's history. It is not well known even in Scotland, and they are also raising awareness so that the thousands of accused and executed can receive legal pardon and apologies, and to create a national memorial for those who lost their lives in the trials. They achieved their first goal in 2022 when Scotland's first MP, Nicola Sturgeon, made a public formal apology, but that is all that's happened as of now. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Scottish witch trials as a way to help spread the story and hopefully add to the momentum of getting these people pardoned and memorialized. And I'll link their website in the episode description if you want to learn more. So first we have to get into what life was like in Scotland in the mid 1500s. I think the biggest thing to understand for this time period is that people genuinely believed in magic. It was kind of a fundamental belief, and it was a part of their everyday lives. You could literally just go to the market and buy medical services, and you could buy magical services. And there was good magic, and then of course there had to be bad magic. And it may seem silly to us now, but much was unknown about the world and how things worked, and life was very dangerous and fragile and hard. So magic was how people coped because it gave them a sense of control and protection. It was also a widespread belief that the supernatural and natural world were interwoven. And this is, think fairies, that kind of stuff. In this belief system, there were 4 main types of magicians. First, you had the service magicians, which was basically a catch-all for people who traded in practical magic. Then you had charmers or charmerers. These are people that created spells, spoken word, and had magical recipes. Then you had the cunning folk, which were people who used ritual or ceremonial magic, like summoning spirits. And then we have the witch. and their magic was wholly dependent on the devil, whereas the other types of magicians' magic did not. But this definition is kind of from the later part, from when the witch trials start happening. A witch initially was just someone who basically used magic to help people. The magician's work was not full time, it was just a way to make a little extra money on the side, and it usually related to the person's full time work. So, for example, a farmer might sell magical potions to strengthen livestock. And even priests got in on the magic act as long as the higher ups didn't really know about it. An interesting and kind of ironic side note, Ireland remains relatively unaffected by the witch trials that swept through Europe during this time, and that's most likely due to the fact of the strength of their belief in magic. They weren't really scared by the ideas of devils or demons. It was just part of their life. The Scottish Protestant Reformation also hit the scene in the 1500s. Coincidence? Methinks not. As a refresher, this comes from King Henry VIII wanting to divorce his wife. So he starts the Church of England and becomes the head of that church and separates from the Pope and the Catholic Church. And then this Protestantism moves on up north to Scotland. And the Scottish Reformation was led by a man named John Knox. He was a minister, and his passionate sermons sparked violence towards Catholic priests' homes and statues. And by the spring of that year, he led an armed revolt that eventually became the start of the Scottish Reformation. This left Scotland in an interesting position. Their Queen Mary of Scots, was Catholic, but she allowed the Protestants to do their thing, and they eventually had their own parliament. And it's this parliament that passes the Witchcraft Act of 1563. And it wasn't like there was a shit ton of witches walking around at this time. It was more likely a way to begin to rid Scotland of supernatural beliefs. This was also a way for them to legislate and go after Catholics, witches, and devils all in one. And they were also probably trying to keep up with England, who by this time already had 2 Witchcraft Acts. The Witchcraft Act banned the practice of witchcraft, sorcery, and necromancy, which is talking to the dead, and anyone who consults with any of the above. It's interesting to note that 1, they don't define these terms. That's how commonplace all of this type of supernatural things are. And 2, the crime is witchcraft and not actually being a witch. And they have one Bible verse to back them up, and that's Exodus 22:18, and that says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." So now Scottish Parliament has both God and the law on their side, and they can start hunting witches. Another interesting thing to note before the Reformation, and this is what I was kind of alluding to in the beginning, a witch was just someone who used magical powers to help people, but by the 1590s, a witch was specifically someone who had powers given to them by the devil. Also, nowhere in the legislation was gender mentioned, and yet 85% of the 4,000 accused were women. And the authors write, quote, "It's almost as if there was some inherent bias against women in this patriarchal society," end quote. Very interesting indeed. And even though the act first came about in 1563, the first witch purge wouldn't really happen until the 1590s when Mary Queen of Scots' son, King James VI, takes the throne. And we'll see he is pretty obsessed with witches. So what was a witch? Well, King James VI wrote a very famous book on witches, which you may have heard of, called Demonology, in 1597. It's broken into 3 parts. Part 1 is about magic, Part 2 is about sorcery and witchcraft, and Part 3 is all the other miscellaneous ghosts and spirits. So it was written in the form of 2 dudes talking to each other. The first was Philomathes, which means lover of learning in Greek. And he was new to the subject and curious, but a little bit skeptical. And then the other dude was Epistemon, which was knowledgeable one in Greek. He was wise and he understands the real and present danger of the magics. All right, so the authors of this book focus on part 2, which is the one that talks about witchcraft. What I thought was really interesting was he actually wrote this book to counteract other contemporary writers that went against his beliefs and believed that witchcraft wasn't real. The first guy was Reginald Scott. He was an English member of Parliament who wrote The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584, and he proposed that most witchcraft and magic were just stage magic and could be disproved. And the myth was that when James took the English throne, he had all of the copies of Reginald's book burned in a pyre. The second dude was Johann Weir. He was a Dutchman who wrote on the illusions of the demons and on spells and poisons in 1563. This was the same year the Scottish Witchcraft Act passed. He suggested the crime of witchcraft was virtually impossible and that most people who confessed were mentally ill or, quote, melancholic, end quote. And I'd argue, I don't know, maybe they were also tortured for days on end. James said that this belief clearly showed Weir was himself a witch, clearly. And I think these two examples of people speaking out or providing alternative viewpoints shows that throughout history, there's always been people on the quote right side. And so it's kind of, in my opinion, BS to say that, oh, well, that's just how it was, or they didn't know any better. That's just how everyone did things back then, because they did know better. So I think we should maybe look for the other voices in history, and maybe we should stop giving all these excuses to people in history who did bad things. So you've got people that are trying to prosecute witches. At the same time, you have people saying that witchcraft isn't real. It's the same thing as you have people owning human beings in slavery and also having people speak out against slavery. But we have this idea that to excuse past behavior entirely just because that's how things were and they didn't know any better. But I think this is a really good example of, at the same time that people were killing other people for being witches, you had other people speaking out saying that's not actually okay. Why are these voices not as prevalent? Who writes the history? You know, like King James tried to burn all that guy's books. So is that why we're not hearing their side of the story? Is it that people in history didn't know right from wrong? Or was it that the people in power doing the wrong thing, silencing the opposition? Just something to think about. And that's what I thought of when I read that part of the book. With demonology, James sets to prove two things. One, the devil and his witches are real. And two, any servants of the devil deserve to be punished. So here's what he had to say about witches. And if witches had the power of the devil, why don't they just kill everyone? James' response is, or the devil's power is limited, and God has the power to rein in the acts of the devil. And then this leads to the implication that if someone was truly innocent, God would intervene on their behalf and stop any injustices from happening. The next part of the book goes into what is a witch and how do you become one. So James says that the devil gets poor people by promising riches and promises rich people revenge. But the biggest thing is that you have to be ungodly and hold contempt for God in your heart. All right, so then he kind of sets up how you turn a witch, and you do it in 3 simple dates. So first he makes his target feel like shit. He fills them with more and more despair until they're at their lowest. And then that's when he shows up. He shows up as a disembodied voice or a man, typical. Then he gets them all alone and asks them what's wrong with them and promises to alleviate their pain and suffering, but only if they follow his orders. So for the second date, he meets up with them only after they promise to give themselves over to him, that he reveals that he's the devil. So he's like, I tricked you, bitch. But now it's too late because they've already renounced their baptisms. He places his mark on a secret part of their body, and it's painful and unhealed until their third meeting. And then their third date, the devil heals the wound and teaches them how to get their revenge or to make money through illegal means, obviously. And how do witches travel? Sadly, James dispels common tropes that witches can teleport or shapeshift or leave their bodies in bed and travel. He is a bummer and says none of this is true. Boo. So then what can witches do and why are they mostly women? So even James at this point recognizes that there's some gender disparity here. He says that women are the weaker sex, so it's just easier for them to be entrapped by the devil, and it's always been this way ever since Eve was deceived by the devil as a snake. Does God allow his faithful to be afflicted by witches? And there's three types that God allows to be tempted or troubled by witches. One, the wicked for their horrible sins. Two, the godly who are weak in faith. And three, the most holy to test their patience. So pretty much no one is safe from a witch. The witch's power only stops if proper godly lawmen or magistrates apprehend them. The only relief comes from confession, and then God stops the devil from tormenting them. Many women died in prison due to the conditions they were in, their poor health, torture, or most likely a combination of those. They also attributed any suicides of the women while they were in jail to the devil and not as a way for them to escape this man-made hell on earth. And this was James's time to differentiate himself from his Catholic mom and clearly reject Catholicism. He says in the blind papistry, the ignorant Catholics had been deceived by the devil into interacting with all kinds of spirits and apparitions. In Protestant times, they now had the correct faith, but there's still people out there living contrary to their faith. And because of this sin of religion, that the evil acts of witchcraft and magic have flourished. Why can't you just reject the existence of all spirits just outright? And James says, well, the spirits are of the devil, and if you deny the devil, then you deny God. It's also important to note that James stated God was superior to the devil, and anything the devil did was because God allowed it, which I think is kind of a messed up way to think that God was cool with all this. Anyways, demonology was also James's pitch for becoming the king of England. He was so holy and divinely chosen, the devil was trying to bring him down. But with his superior knowledge about the devil and witches, he would be able to keep England and Scotland safe. Another cool thing about this book is that in between chapters and sections, it will do a portrait of the accused where it goes into a little bit more depth of a individual who was accused of being a witch during this time. And here's one that really stayed with me. This was a person named Alison or Margaret Balfour. She was accused of being a witch and she refused to confess even after being tortured. So what they decided to do was to bring in her family, which was her elderly husband and her young son and daughter, and then they had her family members tortured in front of her. It was only when they started to torture her 7-year-old daughter that she confessed. Her son's leg was also smashed, and after they got the confession, she was executed, even though she recanted her confession. So that just kind of shows you the brutality that these people went through. Not only themselves, but their family members as well. And once you were accused of a witch, there was kind of no way out for you, and they would just torture you until you confessed. There was really no way of getting out of it. And how did the witch trials start? So we have to remember that life was extremely difficult back then, especially in areas we see large-scale witch hunts, which is an interesting correlation, right? If your livestock died or got sick, if your crops failed, you were screwed. Disease and malnutrition often killed babies, and life expectancy was around 35 years old at this time. Combine this with the church giving you a belief system that tells you why things happen and who should be blamed. It's the perfect storm for scapegoating. Most confessions, it's pretty obvious that the voice belongs to the interrogator. Most witch confessions are simple, basic, and sound very similar to each other. Sometimes the accused use this time to confess real sins since they knew they were most likely going to be killed. When we see the actual accused voice come through on recorded confessions, they are seemingly making up horrific things because they are so random and they just want to make the torture and the horror of their situation stop. The example of someone named Anna Tate, who was caught trying to kill herself. She confessed to killing her first husband with poison in order to marry her second husband, and then killed her daughter accidentally when giving her something to terminate her pregnancy. And most likely, this was her real confession, but the witch hunters didn't care about her real sins. They wanted to know about her witch activities, which is it's a very interesting example that we have in the records. And then another example is a woman who confessed to her baby dying, but she talks about it in terms of fairies. She claims that they turned her baby into a tree stump or like a log, and then that log was used for a fire. So it's interesting, like, so what actually happened to that baby? The true confessions sprinkled into the witch confessions are very interesting and show real hardships in the lives of these women. And another thing the authors keep going back to is why were so many women accused of being witches when men had all the power during this time? And they hypothesize that the men in power were extremely scared that those without power, mostly women, would try to take that power away by any means necessary. And back to John Knox, the guy that kind of led the Scottish Reformation, he argued that female monarchs were an affront to God, which was also a dig at the Catholics because the Mary Queen of Scots was the queen at the time. But he did still believe in the idea that Queen Mary was chosen by God to be his envoy on earth. But a male would be better. So that was a very interesting take. It was a weird belief that seemed to be treasonous and saying that you knew better than God, which is pretty ballsy of Knox to say. These beliefs were published and didn't age well because when Queen Lizzie took the throne in 1559, she was a Protestant. Knox's colleagues were all given elevated posts in the Church of England, but Queen Elizabeth I refused to do the same for Knox, and it's said that she never forgave him for what he wrote about women being inferior monarchs. Go off, Queen. We might think witches are a crazy, unbelievable idea today, but it's not hard to see how it happened back then. There was gossip and written accounts. Stories got repeated in courts, on the streets, in different publications. Therefore, it must be true. This could be a reason why so many confessions were so similar. The stories, accounts, narratives permeated the culture at this time. It's the same as people saying today, like I saw it on TikTok or I saw it on Instagram, when really it's a random Facebook post. And conspiracy theories still abound today. I'd argue that what some people believe are just as crazy as believing that witches are real. But also, most people were illiterate in Scotland in the 1500s. Reading was a privilege of wealthy men who were also the ones that were in charge of the country and leading these witchcraft trials. Also, the binary belief of good versus evil, God versus the devil, probably also led to more women being accused, because if men were the morally superior on God's side, you would need the opposing side. So enter women and the devil. So enter women, which would be the devil's natural choice. Historian Marion Gibson says, quote, "One of the great truths is about people hating women. And it's really important to keep saying that. You can say all sorts of other things. It's about economic circumstances. And yes, that's very important. But gender's part of it. But the central truth is that it's about women." How was someone accused? So changes in 1597 when the Kirk or church sessions, aka local church courts, largely took over. After Scottish independence in the 1660s, the Church of Scotland dominated all aspects of life. There were up to 3 services a day that were hours long, and there were hours-long sermons on Sundays. Church elders were also magistrates and bailies, which are civil officers who enforced decisions. So the church elders, they held both civic and religious power. One reason for snowball accusations was that people believed witches rolled in covens of at least 13 people. And when one witch was found, they believed that other witches were hiding in the town. So the family of the accused basically has to pay for all of the trial and the food, drinks for the general or for the guards and for the questioners. And if the family couldn't pay, then the town council took the debt. So the whole process starts with someone going to Edinburgh to see the Privy Council, which oversaw the running of Scotland basically. And they would show the council the confessions and ask for a commission to start the trial. The financial records are some of the best primary sources for studying the witch trials. There's not much of written confessions or court documents that have survived, and they believe that some were purposefully destroyed because of the embarrassment after the fact. There was a third dude who held power in this time besides the magistrate and the minister, and this was the witch pricker. And his power was absolute. The witch pricker was one of the main ways that guilt was proven. And the witch pricker, what he did was to find the devil's mark on someone. So this had sexism in its judgment. It's kind of gross. Men would judge women's bodies. They would often make them completely disrobe, shave their heads, and then examine every inch of their bodies to find this devil's mark. But it also had class and privilege issues. People of higher wealth and status could afford better nutrition than poorer people, and poor people would have, also worse diets, worse sanitation, and harsher working conditions, which all could lead to physical impairments or other deformities like scars, calluses, etc. And those could all be deemed as the devil's mark. The witch finder or witch pricker became a profession, and they had the power to ID and confirm guilt. This role is thought to be the reason for the exponential growth in executions in Scotland and England in the 1600s. An infamous witch pricker, Matthew Hopkins, charged a town £23, which is around £5,000 today. He's responsible for hundreds of hangings from 1644 to 1647. And then, like I said, once you're accused, there's kind of no way getting out. If there was no visible devil's mark, that's okay, because you would just use a tool called the witch pricker, aka needles or knives, which would find the invisible devil's mark. And it was thought that a witch would not bleed at this spot, so they would poke around their body. And supposedly, Hopkins had a witch pricking device that would retract, like a fake prop knife that we would see today, so that he was always able to find the devil's mark and collect his money. So, if a devil's mark never bled and he had a fake knife going into someone's skin, they're never going to draw blood. So he's like, oh, there's another witch. It's important to note that witch prickers were paid by the head, thus incentivizing them to lie and try to make up ways of finding witches, which is also pretty insane. There was even a woman witch pricker who disguised herself as a man. Her name was Christian Cartel, but she went by other names like Peterson Dixon and Dick. From the records, we know she was responsible for 6 to 10 executions. She was found out when a witch commission was determined to be disingenuous, and it was actually this guy trying to evict his tenants by accusing them of being witches. She was arrested at this point, and maybe someone had some suspicions, but otherwise they were shocked when she turned out to be a woman. She was not executed, but sent to Barbados to be an indentured servant. And the book has some pictures of what these witch pricker tools looked like, and I'll put them in the Instagram post at Yappin' About History Pod. You might ask why a woman would be a witch pricker, and it was probably to make a lot of money, which a woman couldn't do under normal circumstances, and to protect herself from being accused of being a witch. The confession was the most important aspect of the witch trial, and it was easy to get after torture and or keeping people awake for several days at a time, which was not considered torture. And the Privy Council eventually bans, known torture, but they can still keep people awake. So it's not really surprising that people confessed and why their confessions seem so fantastical. However, so many confessions were similarly told. Questioners either kept asking till they got the answer they wanted and or fed the accused answers. Plus, if the accused couldn't read, how could they even know what was being written down? Remember the power dynamics in play here. Most accused were poor and lower class, which means less education. And so then how did the actual trials work? Two-thirds of the accused were executed, some were banished, and a few were acquitted, although there's not record of the reasoning for why they were acquitted. And remember, they had to make sure that the witchcraft was actually being done or a witch consulted because the Witchcraft Acts said that simply being a witch was not a crime for the time. The authors write, despite what we see as flimsy reasoning, it's important to remember that this was a proper legal trial with evidence being produced and the judges assessing it and carrying out legal tests. Some modern folk believe witchcraft trials were carried out by angry peasants waving pitchforks, and perhaps it's easier to think of them this way. No one wants to admit their judicial system, the system put into place to keep society fair and balanced, could get it so wrong. But it did, with catastrophic consequences for those accused. The accused were strangled to death and then their bodies burned to ash so that the devil could not reincarnate them. Sometimes they were burned alive, but this was an exception to the normal procedure despite popular culture. But there is kind of one exception, and this is someone who has become known as the most famous witch of Scotland. Her name was Lilias Addie, and she was an old woman accused of witchcraft, and she, quote, confessed. Most evidence of record seemed to point that they had been made up because she died in custody. The minister at the time didn't know what to do, so he buried her in the shore under a huge slab of stone. Because she was not technically found guilty through a trial, she was not a witch, so she required burial. But witches could not cross water, so he was keeping everyone in the town safe just in case she was a witch. We know this to be real because you can see the slab of concrete, and all the locals kind of know where it is, and it's kind of been passed down orally from generation to generation. Her bones were stolen in the mid 1800s, and kind of in a random small world coincidence, Andrew Carnegie is gifted a walking stick made out of wood from her coffin, and her bones were displayed randomly throughout that time period, but we kind of lose track of where they are, and they still have not been found since. The authors also briefly mention the American witch trials in a comparison to the Scottish witch trials, and I found that very interesting as well. I did not really know much about the Scottish witch trials. I knew that Europe had its own and that they were a lot worse than Salem, but the authors also state that this is kind of a common understanding of witch trials. The Salem witch trials are much more well known in Scotland than their own witch trial. They read the Crucible in school, but nothing about the Scottish witch trials, so that could be a reason. So one of the big differences is that of the 156 accused and jailed in Salem, 79 had their charges based on spectral evidence alone. So that was someone saying that they saw a ghost or some sort of spirits, and that was the only evidence. However, this didn't make much sense even at that time in 1692. Other Boston area ministers wrote to Salem being like, hey, maybe don't do that. And it was only after the Massachusetts governor's wife was accused of being a witch via spectral evidence that he was like, actually, I don't think spectral evidence should be used anymore. It's very similar to today, where people only start to complain about unjust laws when those laws start to affect themselves. Sound familiar? A new formal court established after that, and they did not allow spectral evidence. Most people in jail were eventually acquitted, but a few guilty verdicts remained. The governor took decisive action and declared them all innocent, and most were released from jail. But you had to pay your jail bill before release. They had to pay for everything, similar to some of the Scottish witch trials, including the chains that bound them. Sadly, some could not afford to buy their way out, and they died in jail. Besides the death toll and time span, another big difference between the two countries' witch trials is that the Salem accused immediately started asking for pardons, and most got them within 2 decades of the witch trials. In 2001, all names were cleared except for Elizabeth Johnson, and that's most likely because she was unmarried and had no children. But this changed in 2022 when an eighth grade class decided to rectify this by doing their own research and writing to their state senator who created legislation, and Johnson was finally cleared 329 years after her trial. And this is a big thing that Claire and Zoe are trying to do with their podcast and this book is trying to get formal pardons, which has not happened yet for any of the accused in Scotland. And so, how did the witch trials end? The last person executed was a woman named Janet Horne. Although this is sort of a catch-all name for the accused back then, akin to Jane Doe. She was executed in 1727. Sadly, it's likely that she was suffering from dementia, and she was sentenced to death in an illegal court proceeding. By this time, public sentiment was turning against witch hunts. A new Witchcraft Act was passed in 1735, which now made claiming to practice witchcraft a crime. So therefore saying there was no such thing as witches. And interesting to note, the Irish Witchcraft Acts were not repealed until 1821. This Janet Horne was the last person to be executed under the Witch Trial Act, or the Witchcraft Act, but she was not the last person to be tried under it. The last person to be convicted under the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was in 1944. Her name was Helen. She was a part of the spiritualist movement that we kind of talked about briefly last episode, and she became a famous seanceist, but she was disproven a few times, but that did not stop her popularity. But she got in more serious trouble when she claimed to have seen a dead soldier from the HMS Barnum, which was sunk in 1941 during World War II. This was concerning to the people in charge militarily and in the government because there was a strict no talking secret clearance about this tragedy for security reasons. So they were kind of like, how does she know about this? Because obviously she can't actually talk to dead people, so she must be a spy or something. But I think the more straightforward answer is that all 862 deceased sailors' families were notified and, people talk. She's not arrested until 1944, and this is probably because the Allies were prepping for D-Day and they didn't want talk of shipping or, the military stuff going on with such a popular person. She was tried under the Witchcraft Act. Most fortune-telling or mediums were tried under something called the Vagrancy Act of 1824, and Helen was tried under that too, but also had the Witchcraft Act tacked onto it, because the Vagrancy Act does not have any jail time associated with it, but the Witchcraft Act does. So at some point they drop the vagrancy charge and proceed with the Witchcraft Act to make an example of her. Her defense brought dozens of witnesses, all claiming that Helen was legit and that she could actually talk to the dead people. But this played into the prosecution's hands because, remember, the 1735 Act basically says witchcraft is not real, so anyone claiming to be able to do any kind of witchcraft or conjuring was a fraud and therefore could be charged. She was made an example of and sentenced to 9 months in jail. But afterwards, she kept doing her spiritualism stuff and seances, and she died in 1956, shortly after a police raid onto her seance. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was not repealed until 1951. Her case still shows similar patterns as the witch trial century before her. She was of poor health and had many children and a disabled husband to take care of. She was vulnerable and used as a figure to control the populace during a time of social anxiety, and she was a woman. And sadly, the case of witchcraft accusations does not end there. There's now a new wave of witchcraft accusations occurring right now. And that's how Zoe and Claire end the book. It's more documented in certain parts of Africa right now, but there's new emerging data showing that witchcraft accusations are also on the rise in China and India. From the book, they write, as of 2025, there are several countries which witchcraft accusations are still rife. These include, but are not limited to, Nigeria, Malawi, Ghana, China, Papua New Guinea, and India. Figures are imprecise due to stigma and secrecy, but researchers are confident that accusations are in the hundreds. As with the Scottish experience, the accused are often, though not always, older, isolated women, and consequences can range from banishments, such as the witch camps of Ghana, or physical punishments, to, and we cannot believe we are writing this in the 21st century, execution. And just to note, witch camps are set up for women who've been excluded from their communities due to accusations and can live without fear of further attacks. So the witch camps are kind of safe spaces for these women. They also highlight someone who has created an organization to help these people, and his name is Leo Igwe. He heads up an organization called the Advocacy for Alleged Witches, or AFAW, and that works across various African countries, but it's largely based in Nigeria and Malawi. And then in the US, there's the rise of extremist Christian nationalist churches and pastors who are accusing those they deem as enemies as witches. For example, in the book, they talk about an evangelical leader named Lance Wallnau, who suggested that Vice President Kamala Harris used witchcraft in one of her debates. He said, quote, "She can look presidential. That's the seduction of what I would say is witchcraft. That's the manipulation of imagery that creates an impression contrary to the truth, but it seduces you into seeing it." So that spirit, that occult spirit, I believe is operating on her and through her, end quote. And this pastor would go on to host the then VP candidate JD Vance in September of 2024. All right, so I'll wrap it up with some concluding thoughts. The fact is that the accused bodies were burned and their deaths recorded in the official documents in only the most basic of terms, oftentimes not even including names, just stating witches. Record keeping was often very poor, and there was no benefit to recording the details of a witch. The accused weren't so much written out of history as never properly written into it. Although we know thousands were accused, there are rarely full records of what happened. And there's only one privately commissioned memorial, and it's at the corner of the Edinburgh Castle Esplanade. Authors say it's easy to miss, and I can vouch for that because I've been there and I do not remember seeing a witch memorial. But the memorial is at the spot in the castle where hundreds were killed, and it was made in the 1800s, and the inscription is kind of the part that annoys me and the authors because it says that they were all witches. It's just that some were good witches and some were bad witches. And I'm going to quote the authors because I really liked how they talked about the importance of having a memorial. Quote, "Memorialization is about connection. If we make the link between the past and ourselves, we're more likely not to repeat the more horrifying aspects of our history. Ultimately, we would like to see the statues of women around Scotland that reflect what has made Scotland the country it is today. This, we feel, should incorporate the darker parts of our history, which necessarily means including the witch trials." End quote. What they do talk about kind of maybe a modern way of memorializing the accused, and that's through something called the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft. It's a staggering memorial of sorts in a place where almost all of the names of the accused are gathered. Thanks to the ongoing work of citizen detectives, independent scholars, and community campaigners, new names and stories are uncovered all the time across Scotland. The Survey of Scottish Witchcraft is an evolving, highly useful, and compelling way of remembering the accused. Although it's different from a statue or plaque, perhaps in the 21st century, this is a fitting manner of remembering and exploring the past because it is so democratic and accessible. So you can actually see this online, and you can zoom into different parts of Scotland, and they'll have all the names of the accused and executed for that. It's a very good scholarship. There's many people that have worked on this for many years. I'll link this website in the episode description as well. The authors go on to say that they're still keen on having a physical memorial somewhere in Scotland. There are already several plaques dotted across the country commemorating the trials, sometimes for groups of women and sometimes individuals. It's very moving to know that people have researched and fundraised in their entire local areas to discover and remember those accused. They believe what's needed is something that connects the staggering barbarity of the trials with the fact that these were real people, mostly real women, who were just like us, and that something that can bridge the women's experiences to today and hopefully helps bring about significant change. And I'd like to end with the authors talking about my favorite part of the Salem Witch Museum, and that's the last thing that you see when you walk out, and it's called the Witch Hunt Wall. And they quote Rachel Christ Doan, who is the director of education for the Salem Witch Museum. She says, "The last thing our visitors see as they leave the museum is called our witch hunt wall, and it's a formula we use to break down former witch hunts. The formula is fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat. Fear of the devil was, in the case of Salem, triggered by a mysterious, incurable ailment that led to 150 people being scapegoated with accusations of witchcraft." The museum curators also draw parallels with more contemporary American historical occurrences. What happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, the McCarthy hearing and blacklist during the Cold War, the scapegoating of the gay community during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And while the authors of How to Kill a Witch, the Patriarchy's Guide for Silencing Women, do focus on the gendered aspect of the witch trials, which is fair, and that's, it's in their title. They're relating it and they're putting it in the frame of the patriarchy and, sexism and gender and all that stuff. But I agree with that, but I also like the Salem Witch Museum's like kind of zoomed out view of witch trials. And that's why I wanted to end with the witch hunt wall and the formula of fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat, because that's something that is very important to be able to recognize because it still happens today. And I think that also kind of shows why history is so important to learn and to remember so that we can be more prepared and educated and be able to hopefully speak out when we see these things being repeated. Unfortunately, we are in a prime time for scapegoating. Times are tough financially for many people. There's a lot of political unease. There's also unease about the future in terms of AI and job security, and not to mention all of the global conflicts. So those are our fears and triggers, right? So who are the scapegoats? What vulnerable population is being targeted in our society? Who are being kidnapped off the streets? Who are being held, detained, and even removed from this country without due process? I'd argue that the U.S. is in the middle of its own witch hunt right now. I'd like to end this episode with an excerpt from the book where the authors tell us what we can do to end literal and figurative witch trials and keep them from occurring in the future. Quote, "Take up space. Get involved in grassroots politics, educate people around you about what happened during the witch trials, and draw the parallel with today. When you are met with resistance, call it out. We need to be sure we elect those who will actively protect our safety, safeguard the rights we currently have, and promote real equality going forward. We need to hold our politicians and public bodies to account, and we need to join with women all over the world to stop modern witch trials and show our strength in numbers. So we say fuck being nice to keep the peace or to keep other people happy. Fuck having to keep quiet for fear of being labeled difficult. Fuck living, laughing, loving. Try shouting, swearing, fighting. Call out misogyny, challenge the norm, and be a quarrelsome dame." Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something interesting, and stay tuned for next week for another spooky episode. Who cares if it's not October anymore? It's now dark at 5 p.m., and I think that in itself is very spooky. So I'll see you next week. Goodbye.